So, hello for the second time during week 3. This is a short lecture on volcanic activity. So, in Minnesota, I hear a lot of teachers saying, oh, it's so boring, there's no volcanoes. A lot of the state's rocks are volcanic in origin. There was a lot of volcanic activity here. It was just a long time ago, but that means we can go and look at those rocks in Minnesota now and not be worried about whether or not we're going to get into trouble with a volcanic flow or something. So I'm going to share my screen. So we're talking about volcanism, and I'm teaching a course on Antarctica at the moment. So what we're looking at here is an image of Mount Erebus, the southernmost volcano in the world. It's in Antarctica. And the reason I put it up here is a lot of people have this preconception that volcanoes are only in the tropics, in jungles, in places where it's hot and steamy. No. What I'm hoping is, after having briefly looked at plate tectonics, you'll appreciate that volcanic activity is associated with different plate boundaries. So let's just remind ourselves of that. Here in the diagram in the middle on the right, we have a depiction of a range of different types of plate movement. So I want you to look first on the left. Here we're looking at a bit of ocean crust that's colliding with other ocean crust. And the piece of ocean crust on the right is diving down or being subducted beneath the other ocean crust. That process results in melting in the overriding plate, and that produces this magma chamber that feeds a bunch of volcanoes, which make up an island arc. And there's a trench in here on the oceanward side. Now, basically a similar type thing happens over here on the right, where we have ocean crust diving down, being subducted, but this time it's beneath a piece of continent. And what's happening here is that subducted plate is melting the bit of continent to make magma, and we also have a chain of volcanoes. So think here at the Andes in South America, and here we have our ocean trench on the oceanward side. Where else do volcanoes get made, or where else is there volcanic activity? Continental rifts. So if you move all the way over to the right here, we're in middle of a continent, and then for a whole variety of complicated reasons, that continent starts to pull apart. That is a continental rift. And we had a big one in Minnesota about approximately a billion years ago. The continent started to pull apart, and that made all the rocks along the north shore of Lake Superior. So that's continental rifts. A current example of a continental rift is the East African Rift Valley. Other places where volcanic activity takes place are mid-ocean ridges or spreading centers. That's divergent plate boundaries. Now, that isn't so evident to us because it's all happening on the seafloor. It's only rarely that those volcanic edifices reach above sea level. Let's just think about the recent volcanic eruptions in Iceland. Iceland sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge. It also happens to sit above a hotspot. A hotspot is a place in Earth's mantle where there's what we call a mantle plume coming up. It's like putting a bit of a blowtorch underneath the oceanic crust. It just melts that to make volcanoes. So the example of a hotspot volcano would be Hawaii. So that's all the places where you get volcanism. All right, so what actually is volcanic activity? So first, any place where molten material, lava, and other products, we'll get to that, reach the surface. And one way that people divide up the different types of volcanic activity is into two groups. People often call it either explosive and violent, or passive, or quiet, or effusive. And so up at the top, we have an example of explosive or violent volcanism, and down below, we have some passive, quiet, or effusive volcanism. And yes, I stole these slides from my Antarctica presentation. So I'm not going to show all these videos. I do want to say something about them. The one down here, Nyiragongo, is of a lava lake. There are only 3 known lava lakes in the craters of volcanoes in the world. I love this video. It's ridiculously dramatic, but it's great. And these give a range of depictions of volcanic activity. I've just cherry-picked a few, and they aren't the most recent ones. So now, as we try to understand what happens, first of all, let's think about what actually gets erupted. It can really be subdivided into 3 things. Lava, so that means molten material, or what we call pyroclastic material. The other word we use for that is tephra. So what is this pyroclastic material? Well, it's broken up rock, so broken up lava that's cooled to make rock. There may be individual crystals. There may be what we call lava bombs. That's molten rock, molten lava that's flung out of the volcano and shoots through the air and goes on the ground. And there are a bunch of relatively uncreative words for that. People talk about cowpat bombs, bread crust bombs, etc. There's ash and dust, and they're formed when the gas bubbles inside the molten material that's being ejected, the gas expands, and that forces the molten material, well, not only to cool, but it breaks into these tiny little gas bubble walls that makes volcanic ash, which is actually terrible to breathe. That's an understatement. And then there's gases that get emitted. When you're looking at a volcanic eruption, if you're just seeing a sort of clear whitish color, that's usually telling you it's just gas. It may be water vapor plus some other things. But if it's sort of gray and colored, that tells you that there's some pyroclastic material in that little eruption cloud. So we've established that there's explosive and passive eruptions. Now, this is where it gets exciting. This is actually tied to the viscosity of the magma. So we need to think about viscosity. And this can be hard to wrap your brain around. what is viscosity? It is resistance to flow. So focus on the words first. It's resistance to flow. So if something is less viscous, it flows easily. On the other hand, if it's more viscous, it flows with difficulty. Before we continue, let's just look over here to the right. So if we think about water, that is less viscous than syrup. And what I'm hinting at here is that low viscosity magmas that flow easily are associated with our passive or quiet eruptions, whereas the more viscous magmas that flow with difficulty are associated with explosive eruptions. Correct. Now, we have to go down another rabbit hole now. Viscosity is actually controlled by the percentage of silica in a magma. And this is something you can try just diagramming out or doing some kind of concept map with. So viscosity depends on the percentage of silica in the magma. So let's look at this. A silica-rich magma is very stiff and it does not flow well. Therefore, it is very viscous. And so that is your silicic or felsic magmas. And they usually have more than 66% silica, and that would be a rhyolite. Yes, I know this number may be slightly different to the one I gave you in the previous lecture. There are a multitude of classifications. We're focusing on ballparks. I think I had 63 in the previous presentation. Let's go back here. A silica poor magma is very runny, flows easily, not viscous, and mafic magmas are silica poor, as you know from the classification. An example would be basalt. Why is this connection? Well, so look down here in the dark blue box. What happens is the silica will form chains or polymers in the magma. And that's effectively what makes it flow easily or resist flow. So a more silica-rich magma has more chains or polymers. And what happens is when you have that silica polymerization, that basically stops gas bubbles from escaping. So there's naturally a whole bunch of gas dissolved in magma. And as the pressure on it reduces, it's trying to get out of solution. It's the same thing that happens with a Coke bottle. And when you turn the top to open it up and you hear that's the gas being depressurized. Anyway, low silica, low viscosity, that's your basaltic magmas. Gases can escape more easily. In your high silica magmas, that's highly viscous, and that traps gases. And those gases can only escape explosively, producing these explosive eruptions. Okay, so we've looked at the role of magma composition. I now kind of want to change tack a little bit. So there's really two things to be thinking about if we're thinking about volcanism and what we see as evidence of volcanism. There's the processes that form or create these landforms, and then there's what the various landforms actually look like. So what do I really mean? It's with the word processes or activity. That's just the type of eruption and the type of materials that get produced. On the other hand, with volcanic landform, that's the physical structure. So over here on the right, we're looking at a bunch of different landforms, and they are, I hope, relatively distinct. Why is that? Okay, so on the left, we've got a bunch of different types of activity and or processes. And on the right, I've got what I'm calling volcanic features. You could think landforms here. So these are names of different types of volcanic structure produced by a variety, and usually it's several different types of activity that goes into making one of the landforms on the right. So first of all, I want to start out with the classic stratovolcano. So this is your sort of Mount Fuji style steep-sided volcano. And there's all these components. But what's important here is, why do they make these perfect steep-sided volcanoes? Well, that's because they are a mixture of pyroclastic material, that's the fragmented stuff, and layers of basalt flows. And the pyroclastic material would easily get eroded, but what happens is those basalt flows actually kind of hold it down. So you get layers on layers, and they build up this classic steep-sided volcano that's called a stratovolcano. Now, associated with the production of pyroclastic material is one process called a pyroclastic flow. And so if you have a volcanic eruption and essentially the energy that's holding that eruption cloud up is no longer, that eruption cloud will suddenly collapse and everything in it will move incredibly fast down a slope. And so I'm talking 200 kilometers an hour or more. You cannot get out of the way of a pyroclastic flow. And these are also incredible. I mean, they are really hot, 1200 degrees Celsius or higher. And they're moving gas and rock fragments. You just can't escape from one of these. They also get called nuées ardentes. That's a French word for glowing clouds. And in here you can see a pyroclastic flow, but you can also see some lava. The pyroclastic flows can move up hillsides. So you don't want to be anywhere near a pyroclastic flow. I want to just step back a moment now. What is in pyroclastic material? So we have our classic a stratovolcano here. There may be some molten material and blocks of already cooled material that gets released. Oh, wait a minute. I'm not following my own notes here. So what we're going to focus on is what's over on the right-hand side. So sometimes there are crystals, and here are some images of crystals. These were actually collected from Mount Erebus in Antarctica. So you have a magma chamber and you have some crystals growing. If the conditions are right, they might be shot out and land somewhere near the vent at the top. And if you know someone, they might give you some. So then there's molten rock. And if you look at the image way over on the right here and down here, it either moves through the air to produce these amazing shapes. The ones down here are Pele's tears, and they just sort of form layers. These are all incredibly delicate. Or it falls through the air and lands as fist-sized to maybe small house-sized blocks of molten material that then cools. So those are your bombs and blocks. If it has vesicles in it, it'll be scoria. And then there's ash. So now, what we're looking at now is formation of a cinder cone, but I want to talk specifically about fire fountaining. So this is where it gets confusing. Fire fountaining is just like having a fountain. Just imagine that what you're seeing here is a water fountain, but in fact it's lava, and that lava is sending out all these firework looking things. Those are little blobs of lava. And fire fountaining often takes place along what are called fissures. That's F-I-S-S-U-R-E. Those are cracks in the ground. And yes, it looks dramatic, but it does not count as explosive activity. Essentially, this is when you've got a lava flow that reaches the surface really quickly, and some of the material will land and become scoria. Other times it flows away to make a lava flow. Now, let's look at the structure on the right. This is called a cinder cone, and it's about 1.5 kilometers wide or something like that. If I'm right, this one is in Iceland, and the entire slope is made up of scoria. What you see here is a path that goes up to the top, and it is horrible to walk up because you do 2 steps forward and kind of 1 step back because the scoria just isn't packed down very well. So this was formed by fire fountaining, or it's also called strombolian activity. All these little bits, in this case of basalt, that are flung out, they have lots of air bubbles in them, they land and they build up this cone shape. Now, I want you to also note what's happening in the background. The basalt that was feeding this fire fountaining or strombolian activity also found a way to sneak out just on the backside of the volcano, and all this dark area is actually a lava flow. The other thing I want you to notice is there's this outside rim and then a smaller crater inside. So this cinder cone actually had 2 phases of development. If you walk down into that area, you know, it's just filled with scoria in the center. And it's warm if you sit on it, but there's no lava lake or anything like that here. So that's a cinder cone, fire fountaining, and strombolian activity. So now I want us to think about, first of all, lava flows. So here we've got an example of a lava flow in Hawaii. There are 2 main types of lava flows, pahoehoe and a'a. And this classification is based in part on the temperature. Now, what we're actually looking at here is a pahoehoe flow. The sort of pattern you see in this cooled basalt is called a ropey texture. And if you go to Gooseberry Falls in the summer when there's not too much water, there is a rock below the lower falls in the middle of the river where you can see basalt that has a ropey texture just on the surface of the rock. It's absolutely stunning. So shield volcanoes are very gentle slopes. Hawaii is our best example of a shield volcano. It has a gentle slope, but if you think about how high it is, it grew from the ocean floor up to its current height. So they can be enormous structures. And it's essentially built from multiple lava flows over time. They're called shield volcanoes because supposedly it's the shape of a warrior's shield, that gentle slope, slightly curved. So I want you to imagine that you're somewhere near a stratovolcano and there's an explosive eruption. So if ash and pyroclastic material mix with water, they essentially produce a kind of concrete-like slurry that we call a lahar. So these lahars are really quickly moving, absolutely devastating. They will usually form in river valleys because anything that involves water will be moving downslope. They're easily created too by the melting of snow near a vent. They can be moving at more than 30 meters per second and can be as much as more than 400 feet thick. And they just strip everything off and they can be absolutely devastating to infrastructure. What's also useful or interesting about lahars, imagine an area that has a dry season and there's volcanic activity, whole bunch of pyroclastic material gets deposited and people think, oh, the eruption's over. And then along comes the rainy season. Well, during that rainy season, you can suddenly mobilize all that volcanic material, the pyroclastic material, and you get a lahar coming down river valley at a time that's totally separate to when there was actually a volcanic eruption. So that's what I'm trying to point out in this slide. So lahars can form long after an eruption when rain mixes with that loose sedimentary material that was the pyroclastic deposits. And finally, I want us to think about flood basalts. Well, not finally. These are unusual volcanic sequences. They are essentially a whole bunch of volcanic flows, but they're pulled out because they are these incredibly thick sequences of basalt flows. They can last for 1 to about 3 million years. And they're associated with some of the major extinctions of life on planet Earth. They get called traps. And there's a lot of discussion as to why they might be located where they're located. What I want you to look at in this image is how there is some layering. There's dark and light. That's because what happens is you have a basalt flow, and then there may be, there could be hundreds, maybe 1,000 years before another one. And during that interval, the top of the basalt flow gets chemically altered. That's the pale colored material. And then, whoop, along comes another basalt flow. So that's why you've got these kind of zebra striped layered flood basalts. So finally, let's think about structures that are called calderas. So first of all, what is a caldera? It's a large, maybe 10 to 20 mile diameter sunken area that forms after a huge explosive eruption. And they're also often associated with lava domes forming after the caldera has formed. So on the left here, we're looking at Crater Lake in Oregon. That's the caldera associated with the Mount Mazama eruption. And over to the right is, oh, rats, I've forgotten the name of this island in the South Pacific, but I want you to notice there's a very distinct circular structure, and then there's a lake in here, and then there's a small something happening right in there. How do these get formed? So, essentially we've got I'll call it a four-step process. So we have our magma chamber here, and we have a huge eruption event. Now, we move down to the second diagram here. A lot of magma was used up, and it hasn't been filled up in this case. And that means that the volcano structure can't be supported. So it essentially collapses downward, and that leaves this circular ring around what was once the edge of the volcano, where all the volcano bits kind of collapse down, and that will often fill with water. But goodness me, what happens? Magma is persistent. It starts finding its way up through everything, and it starts making a little lava dome. So at Crater Lake in Oregon, this is called Wizard Island. What do lava domes look like? This is an example of the lava dome inside the crater at Mount St. Helens. And if you follow or go to this link here, I'll put the slides into D2L. You can see it growing. There's a time-lapse video of it. These are often associated with very silicic or felsic magmas. So they're getting ready for more explosive activity. So we can compare these structures that we've looked at, going from a scoria cone to a large shield volcano. I should mention that the word composite volcano is also used for stratovolcanoes. And there is a very good comparison video by Nova summarizing the difference between these volcanic structures. Now, there's also something that's important and gets used for trying to evaluate hazards. That's the volcanic explosivity index, and it involves viscosity, volatiles, that's gases, and how much material is erupted. And I just want to say something about volatiles or gases. So generally it's the word for all the gases trapped in magma. Some of them are pretty harmless and others are toxic. And I put this image in here because I can't remember exactly when. Sometime in the 1800s, there was a big eruption in Iceland, and there was a lot of hydrogen fluoride expelled during that eruption. Now, it's a complicated pathway, but that fluoride made its way into the vegetation. The sheep that were the main source of protein food for Icelanders ate the grass, and the fluorine substituted for calcium in their bones, and their bones kind of collapsed, and there was a absolutely terrible famine. So just a reminder here, more gases dissolved in the magma means you have a more explosive eruption. Now, let's think about volume. Oh, there's how much is erupted during an eruption. There are a bunch of different ways that this gets measured, and there's a whole nother vocabulary associated with it. There's Hawaiian eruptions, Strombolian, subplinian, plinian, ultraplinian, Tzotzilian, Phreatoplinian, etc. And these are detailed in these kind of visual graphs. So just that's so you are aware of this. Now, let's think about how do we actually monitor volcanic hazards? Well, we look for micro earthquakes. Every single volcano has its own heartbeat, if you like. And the volcanologists and seismologists, that's the people who study the earthquakes, get to know exactly how to interpret the seismic signatures. They also install tilt meters, those devices that just measure how much the land is tilting. That happens when you have magma coming up from below, and it makes the slopes maybe get steeper. And then we also measure changes in gas composition, and all that allows us to make predictions in general about the likelihood of a eruption. You know, we also look at the record from the previous eruptive history that can tell us something about how often there are eruptions. So that is a whistle-stop tour through volcanism. So do read the textbook, and thank you very much.